Hi, my name's Jeff Todd. I'm with Prevent Blindness. To kick off our summit today, we've invited Frank Bruni, a New York Times journalist and professor of journalism at Duke University, to join us. We'll be discussing his own experience with vision loss and how it has given him new insight into the human experience, as told in his new book, The Beauty of Dusk on Vision Lost and Found. Welcome, Frank, and thanks for taking the time to join us today.
Thanks for having me.
So your story is about so much more than your sight loss, but of course that's kind of where it stems from. Can you kind of summarize those early days of where this part of your life begins?
Yeah, in October of 2017, one Saturday morning, I woke up and the world didn't look quite right, and it was kind of hard to define at first, but I thought maybe something had worked its way into my eye while I was sleeping. I thought maybe I just needed, to take a shower or have some caffeine. But as the day wore on, it became clear that this distortion in my vision, this sort of blurriness on the right side, wasn't going away. And as I kind of opened and closed each eye, I realized that the problem was localized in my right eye. And even then I thought, okay, you wake up with an ache in your back, a crimp in your neck, like tomorrow morning, Sunday morning, everything will be fine. But it wasn't fine Sunday morning. And thus began a kind of long medical odyssey that in the first week or two involved many eye doctor appointments, a diagnosis of something that goes by the initials NAION. It basically means I had a stroke of the right optic nerve, and that optic nerve was now ravaged to a point where I couldn't see properly and would never see properly again out of my right eye. And that just forced a whole lot of adjustments physically, probably even more adjustments emotionally and psychologically. And that's what I wrote about in the book you mentioned. And it's in that sense that I think any of those of us who experience vision challenges are united to everyone else, because it's a particular kind of challenge, but it's all part of the kind of bigger world of physical challenges and how you accept and adjust to the dawn of limits in your life.
I kind of related as I was reading this book. I think we're roughly around the same age group, but I think it's an age where often you start to face health problems that you don't necessarily previously, not that vision problems are only in this age group. But the early parts of your book reminded me of a quote that I've always appreciated related to public health. And it's from Susan Sontag, who once wrote that everyone who is born holds dual citizenship in the kingdom of the well and in the kingdom of the sick. Although we all prefer to use the good passport, sooner or later, each of us is obliged, at least for a spell, to identify ourselves as citizens of that other place. Can you describe a bit about those early realizations about how your vision challenges would change the way you think about your life?
The way I saw my citizenship. Well, it's interesting, as you were, to digress just for a second, as you were saying that, I haven't read the book, although I mean to, but there's a book that came out the same day as mine called The Invisible Kingdom, which I think plays off that Susan Sontag quote. And it's talking about that kingdom of the sick, but not sick to the naked eye, not sick from the outside.
I'll have to check that out.
And that's something, it's by a writer named Megan O'Rourke, I believe. And that notion of an invisible kingdom, which is the title of her book, became very real to me, and that notion, those notions of a kingdom of the well and a kingdom of the sick. The kingdom of the sick, invisible, is much, much larger. And one of the things I intuitively and then in a very deliberate way realized or reckoned with after I lost sight in my right eye was how many people around me, people I knew well, people I knew a little bit, had been through profound challenges or were going through profound challenges, sometimes physical, medical, sometimes in terms of disruptions in their lives involving kids, involving spouses, involving parents. The overwhelming majority of us, as life goes on, are in a state of struggle. We're in various states of crisis. I think, I don't mean it in a profound sense, but to at least a mild degree, I think suffering is the human condition. And when you realize that, if you can realize that, I think it's paradoxically an enormous balm, because you can no longer see what you're going through as some singular hardship, as some injustice in proportion to the rest of the world. you realize that in fact, it's just the iteration of struggle that you're going through. And when you take self-pity and when you take the improper belief that everybody else is on a glide path to your slog, when you take those off the table, I think you end up in a much more emotionally and psychologically tenable place.
And that kind of leads into one other component of your book. You write the discrepancy between what we see on people on the outside and what they experience on the inside. And you explore that a bit. And I imagine this wasn't really a new insight for you, but it sounds like your experience has really kind of highlighted that. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, some of it is what I just mentioned, but also, we live in an era, and a lot has been written about this. Plenty has been written about this, and I'm glad because it's important. We live in an era where everyone is kind of showing through social media these lacquered lives. Here I am gazing upon the beautiful sunset during my beach vacation. Here I am, at this storybook wedding, and don't we all look fabulous? And social media, because it presents these curated and prettied up selves, becomes a real engine of envy. But it's presenting a mythological world. That's not the world. Those same people are dealing with all sorts of other things that they're not putting on Instagram or on Snapchat or on Facebook. And I became newly sensitive to something we all know, which is that discrepancy you mentioned between public face and private reality. And I realized there's a kind of different way to digest, to consume the media that keeps you oriented in that truth and keeps you away from the false mythology of everyone else's perfect lives. And so I would pause and notice in a special way and take in when an Anthony Bourdain committed suicide, right? I mean, he was someone who, because there was overlap between us in writing and in the writing worlds and the food worlds, he was someone I'd always envied and thought, I don't have a bad life, but to be Anthony Bourdain. Well, to be Anthony Bourdain was a much more complicated thing, obviously, and a much more difficult thing than the public image you saw. Within days of his suicide, I can't remember whose was first, Kate Spade, another symbol of success, another object of great envy. And you could go on with pro athletes who revealed the hideous struggles they were going through. I was just reading yesterday, Jason Kander, a once shooting star politician who had to take a step back because he was in fact in the grip of profound PTSD. He has a book coming out about that struggle. And what is that book ultimately about? It's about that disparity between people whose lives seem to be all promise and all gloss on the outside, but are a whole bunch of different things on the inside. I think we need to hold tight to that and remember that, because it enables us to deal with the people around us in a more realistic and empathetic way. But again, it enables you to assess and process and adjust to your own disappointments in a much more realistic and thus healthy way.
I remember thinking similar things recently with Naomi Judd, who was much more open about her experience, but you'd think someone with all that she had. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah.
So throughout your book, you tap into conversations with a number of people with varying health conditions. And I was so pleased to see that one of them was Cyrus Habib, who actually was the keynote address at this very summit 5 years ago when we were holding it in person. And I have to say, he was arguably the most impactful and memorable speaker we had. And for those who are watching, who were there, or for those who weren't, Mr. Habib was blind since the age of 8, is blind since the age of 8. And to call him a high achiever is just an understatement, as you know. He became the first Iranian American to hold statewide office when he was elected to serve as Lieutenant Governor of Washington at the age of 35, which was an office he held when he spoke with us. So I was interested to read how his life turned after that. Could you share a little bit about what you took away from your conversations with him?
Sure. Well, I should first kind of specify how his life turned, since some of you all saw him. He was in a position, if I have my facts exactly right, where he was due to announce his run for a second term as Lieutenant Governor of Washington, which would have cemented his place as the likely heir apparent to the governor. in a state that tends to elect Democrats like Cyrus to statewide offices. So he would have been, if all went well, the extraordinarily young blind governor of, of a good sized state. And then people probably would have talked about him for even higher office, which would have been extraordinary again for a blind man. And he decided not to run for re-election. He decided instead to take a wild swerve and to take a vow of poverty, a vow of chastity, a vow of obedience, and not just study to be ordained as a Catholic priest, but study to be ordained as a Jesuit, which is a whole other level of commitment and a more difficult path. And I mentioned all that, first blind this, first blind that, because part of his decision was he felt that in spending so much of his life trying to prove what he could do as a blind man, that he could go to Columbia, which he did, that he could become a Rhodes Scholar, which he did, that he could graduate from Yale Law, which he did. He realized that in a weird way, it was a trap. It was a trap of vanity, but it was also a trap of to want to show how much a blind person could transcend and do was to be absorbed, he felt, in himself and in his blindness. And so he was making a radical decision to do something that would be more other-directed than self-directed. And it's an extraordinary story, but I also think it is, in its way, an example of what a disability, what a special kind of challenge can do in a given life in terms of soulfulness, in terms of introspection, in terms of a kind of personal growth that I don't think a lot of people ever manage or even think about. And so I think Cyrus is a fascinating figure in all those regards. And it's why I was thrilled to meet him and write about him first in the New York Times and then to devote a big chunk of one of the late chapters of the book to him.
Yeah, he was just such a genuine person when I met him. It was fascinating to hear that. And those pieces of your book I found particularly interesting, where you dove into other experiences from other people. And it goes back to what you spoke about earlier of these commonalities that we share as human beings.
Yeah, and it's frustrating sometimes because my book is mostly aptly categorized a memoir, yeah. And half of it is me, and it's a memoir of sudden challenge, sudden partial disability, whatever. But as you know, the other half of the book is other people, and I sort of used what happened to me as a pivot into a sort of not just a medical odyssey, but a kind of odyssey of discovery where I went around to people I already knew, to people I was just meeting who had dealt with profound physical challenges or setbacks or upsets in their lives. And I asked them to tell me their stories and to share what they learned. And part of that was a narrative decision, a journalistic decision, but it also awakened me to something that I think if we all realized we'd be richer for, which is people all around us have wisdom. They have slices of wisdom that we never access because we're, too distracted, too polite to ask them deep questions about their lives. And when you start doing that, you not only give them an opportunity to share experiences that in most cases they very much want to share, but you access all of this aggregate wisdom, this accretion of wisdom that most of us don't, and it is a squandered opportunity.
Yeah. In your book, you write, "For as long as your mind remains intact and your energy endures, you are your own best case manager. Others may want or mean to come to the rescue, and in discrete instances may try to, but they're the guests, not the homeowner. They don't stay forever or know how to work the thermostat." So I'd be curious to hear how you embrace this for yourself, but also if you have insights on how we can support others who struggle to have equitable access in what's a very much a complex healthcare system, and how they can create this same level of ownership.
Well, those are two very different things and very different questions, and I'll address them separately and sequentially. What you quoted from my book in the first part was something I was stating as an outgrowth of experiences I had, and probably a lot of people have had as a patient. And that experience was that the doctors I saw all saw me very narrowly in terms of the specific affliction that it seemed I had and that was being confirmed or that was being dealt with. And they seldom looked beyond that to the kind of whole of me or the whole of my challenges and the nuances in front of me. So I was sort of blown away by the fact that while I had great access to healthcare, partly because I had, not extraordinary, but good normal health insurance, but also because I qualified for and made the decision to enroll myself in several clinical trials, which involves a lot of give, of your time, sometimes of discomfort. One of them was injections into my right eye, but it also does give you access, which is something people should know for the duration of those trials, to extraordinary physicians and experts in that field. They're sort of obliged as an ethical matter, for as long as you're in the trial, to be your physicians as well as the people evaluating you for the pharmaceutical company or whatever. So I saw, both through my own normal care and through those clinical trials, a very large number and array of distinguished medical professionals at all levels. Not one of them ever asked me how I was dealing psychologically or emotionally with the threat of blindness, and whether I had sought or thought that maybe counseling would be a good idea. Not one of them, not once. They were seeing me so narrowly in terms of my optic nerve that they didn't look beyond the optic nerve to the rest of me, which seems to me like such a spectacular failure of patient care. Not one of them ever mentioned to me that when you have lost not all of your vision, but a significant chunk, there's a whole field of low vision therapy, low vision rehabilitation. I had to learn that on my own accidentally. And that's what I mean by, if you don't kind of take charge and ask an array of questions about your own situation and about what you need and about your own care that go beyond the specialist and the specialty, you are not going to be taking the best care of yourselves, because yes, you are in the hands of professionals, but they're seeing you in the narrowest way, and they're ultimately not responsible for you. They're seeing you for 1 hour out of a month. In terms of how we can support people who don't have access to care, that's more a political question than it is a literary, or, I have no more or less to say about that than anyone else. As a political matter, I think it is unconscionable that in a country of our wealth, there are people who cannot access proper care. And I don't mean cannot access Cadillac care. I mean literally cannot get in to see the doctors they need to deal with basic, life management, health and medical stuff. And that's a political matter that we should all think long and hard about, when we are engaging in political and public life, and when we're evaluating politicians and political parties.
Yeah. I ask that because at the core of our work at Prevent Blindness, that's what we're about, is access to care, and it's incredibly challenging. But you also touched on something that we've been exploring a lot recently here, more so than we had in the past. And first of all, the whole issue of low vision care. I mean, we continue to be confounded by that people have to find out about that on their own. And so there's a lot of work there to be done. But we've also been exploring kind of the psychosocial impacts of vision and eye health, whether it's patients, parents, caregivers. And you touched on this a little bit, but was there a turning point in your experience where you realized that you not only had to figure out how to address your eye care needs, but also care for your mental health in going through this?
I don't know if there was a turning point. I'm lucky. I think that occurred to me fairly early on. And that's one of those things that kind of is a window onto another injustice. I mean, if you do have a certain level of education, if you've been blessed with that, if you're blessed to be in a field that's about inquiring and problem solving, which I am as someone who's been a journalist, it was sort of natural for me to kind of make a checklist of what I should be thinking about and worried about. But I just realized pretty early on, I think, in the first months during a few kind of emotional valleys, that if I didn't really figure out how to and make a commitment to forging the best attitude about this possible, I could end up in a hole so deep I would never climb out of it. And I say that to people all the time. It is so tempting to shut down in a big way for a long time. But the bigger the shutdown and the longer the shutdown, the harder it's going to be to reactivate everything. The deeper the hole, the harder it's going to be to climb out. And I was blessed in that I intuitively understood that. I could kind of intellectualize that in a helpful way. And I just kind of did little things that were, gauntlets against that kind of despair, inertia, shutdown.
Well, as we kind of wrap up here, I do have one more question. As a journalist and a writer, storytelling is certainly central to your work. Sharing our health-related stories with families, friends, and colleagues, in your case, the world, can be very daunting. Do you think that this process plays a role in your healing, in anyone's healing, is telling that story?
Yeah, I mean, it did in mine, and I think it can to anybody. And I don't mean storytelling in the form of a book. Not everyone can write a book or whatever. But there's that famous line from I think it's the first line, I believe, from Joan Didion's essay, "The White Album," which is the title essay in the collection, "The White Album." And the first sentence is, "We tell ourselves stories in order to live." And you can divine a lot of different meanings in that sentence. But I think one of the meanings of that sentence is to make sense of the events of your life, to give them a shape, to give them a direction, to find in them a moral, and to find in them a kind of purpose on the far side of that moral and of that sentence. That's a lot of the emotional trick of life. And so I do think turning what you've been through into a story can give it both a kind of coherence and a dignity that it might otherwise not have. I also think, we tell stories to share ourselves. And I think it's really important not to go through this stuff alone. And one of the bridges you build to other people, so you're not going through it alone, one of those bridges is the story you tell of what you've been through. And being able to tell that story in a way that is instructive, in a way that emphasizes the universality, not the singularity of what you're going through. That's important stuff in terms of binding you to a community of people who will help you in overt and very subtle ways get through what you're going through.
Well, I have to say, for anyone watching today, I highly recommend this book. It was really a powerful read, and thank you for sharing your story with us today.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity.
Absolutely.